Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and here doing the voiceover for a video that I started a very long time ago. So I started this build in 2022, and it's only just now finally gotten done. And I'm actually watching the playback of this video for the first time in about 3 years, because I edited a lot of this footage at the time that I recorded it. But the build ran into a few problems, so now I get to talk about them. So here I was just starting by routing the truss rod channel. This was a large piece of rosewood. I actually made 2 necks out of it. That's right, I forgot there was a repair that I needed to make in this truss rod channel, because the router bit wandered. Yeah, so here I was making a patch to fill the overly large truss rod channel using a scrap of rosewood from another neck that I had made. And of course just roughly cutting it out with the bandsaw and then taking it over to a spindle sander to get the shape closer to where it needs to be. And just using some super glue to put it into place. And just like that, the truss rod channel was all patched up. Unfortunately, that happened at the body end of the neck, so that wasn't actually the part that needed to be wider. Of course, they're just using some chisels to widen out the headstock end of the truss rod channel so that the rod itself can fit. And using the miter saw to cut the fret slots into this really nice piece of flamed ebony. And this is the same, one of the same 2 pieces of flamed ebony I had bought years ago. The first one I used on Bob 1.5. I actually got a great deal on these. They were being sold as B stock because they had a couple small cracks in them. They're beautiful pieces of wood. I was taking a handsaw to cut off the excess. Worked out pretty nicely with this one that most of the crack in it is on the end that I get to cut off. And you can see suddenly this piece of rosewood has become much smaller since last time it was on camera. So like I mentioned, I had made 2 necks out of this piece of rosewood. The first one went onto the guitar that was my Great Guitar Build-Off entry in, I want to say 2023. Maybe that was also 2022. I think, yeah, that sounds right actually. I'm just cutting out the shape of the headstock. Now I'm taking it over to the router table with the, I guess you could call it a template, but it's just a straight line template that I'm using to straighten both sides of the neck. Guess I have to take this off of the template and switch it around and do all that to actually get the other side. And here using a jig on the spindle sander to get the headstock to the right thickness. It also starts shaping the volute on the back of the headstock as well. And here I'm just drilling for some locating pins that I can use for attaching the fretboard to the neck. for truss rod access. Started with a narrow drill bit to get the location correct, and then brought in the larger drill bit to get the size correct. And here, in the process of gluing on the fretboard, just going to put on some masking tape to keep the glue from getting into the truss rod channel. Put in some toothpicks to make sure that... put in toothpicks to use as the locating pins. Off camera, removed the masking tape. And get it all clamped into place. Just after the glue is dry, get to cut away the excess from the edges of the fretboard. And then of course using a flush trimming bit on the router table to clean up the edges of the fretboard. So here I've gone back to the spindle sander. I'm just going to use that to give a little shape to the end of the fretboard. And personally I feel like the end of the fretboard is a somewhat underexplored design space. Well, at this point I decided to add some binding to the neck. Or rather to the fretboard. I also tried to get a little bit fancier with it than just putting on binding, so I'm not routing away the full thickness of the fretboard edge. So once the binding gets glued on, you can see the rosewood from the neck, and then you can see a little bit of the fretboard, and then above that is the binding. I'm using some of the very little snakewood I have left over from a build from many years ago, and using that as the binding. And a lot of people use super glue for putting on wood binding. I prefer to use wood glue. It's meant for binding wood to wood. That's the way I'm going to use it. I'm also being careful to put very, very little wood glue on there because I don't want a lot of squeeze out. And I particularly don't want squeeze out to get into the fret slots because that's a real pain to clean out later. And then it's back to the flush trimming bit to remove the excess. And you can see there the dark line in between the rosewood and the snakewood that's the original fretboard. Which was by design, that's not an accident. And then we're moving on to inlay, putting in abalone. This was quite a large piece of abalone, so I got most of the bird just out of this one piece, but you can see on the edge there I had to add a tip to the second wing. Just cut it out with a jeweler's saw, clean up the shape with some files. Here I'm getting the tip to the second wing. Actually, looking back on this guitar now, the pattern and the abalone lined up so nicely you can barely even tell that it was two different pieces to make that one bird. Of course, it is separate pieces in between each fret because the fret wire is going to have to involve a cut through it anyway. I also decided to add some fret markers to the odd-numbered frets. These are just some pretty simple straight line inlays. It's also worth noting the Abalone was only for the bird, and regular mother of pearl was for the rest of the inlays. And of course using black super glue because it's in ebony fretboard and the black will blend in quite nicely. This was a medium thick super glue that you can see I had quite a time getting it to flow out enough of it to fill the space there. Probably would have been easier without the wicking tip, but I also didn't want it to end up getting everywhere. See, that piece I hadn't quite cut to the appropriate size, so having to go in with my precision router and widen out the fret slots as they're going through the mother of pearl. And with those in, just going in with the leveling beam to get them all level with the surface of the fretboard. You can see the dust from the mother of pearl really highlighting the flame figure in the ebony. And then it's time to radius the fretboard. And as is my usual tendency, I'm giving this a 14-inch radius. Yeah, they're just using some water to clean it up, and you can really see the figure pop. Alright, so we're still working on the neck, but as you can see, this is an offcut from the body. It was just the right size to make a covering for the headstock. And like the thing on the screen said, it is Spalted Maple. No boy, I am not a fan of working with Spalted Maple. This is the first time I've ever used it, and it's very likely to be the last time. So here I'm just cutting out the piece for truss rod access. This actually went remarkably well. I was able to save this piece and use it as the truss rod cover as well, so that all of the grain matches. They're just using my pilot holes for the tuners as locating pins. And I left this facing really thick because the Spalted Maple was so soft I was afraid it would just break apart into 1,000 pieces if I didn't. I actually see on the edge of the screen there I had sanded it down to be quite a bit thinner. Just did that off camera. Here I'm just using a 3-corner file to break the corners of the fret slots. This makes it a little bit easier to install the frets, and it also makes it a bit easier for someone down the line to remove the frets if they need to be replaced. And once again using that black super glue to fill in the fret slots, just to make sure there's no gaps underneath the frets. And of course, once all the frets are installed, just going to use a file to clean away the edges. And then it's time for leveling. Boy, it's nerve-wracking watching this back, putting the Sharpie on there without any tape over the fretboard itself. Always paranoid that I'm going to accidentally put a Sharpie mark on the wood. And that last shot there, you can see I was putting in a little bit of fall away at the upper frets. And here I'm using the StewMac Z file to crown the frets. And then a traditional crowning file to put in the finishing touches. I think this might have actually been the first time I used that Z file. It's kind of crazy to think about. And just taking some sandpaper and putting a little round over on the tops and cleaning up some of the earlier filing marks. Worked my way up through a couple different grits of sandpaper and then moving on to buffing wheels on my Dremel just to polish them up from there. You can see they came out nice and shiny. Of course, there was a little bit of excess super glue from when I glued in the frets, so I'm taking a small knife and trying to clean some of that away. And you can really see the differences in color in the snakewood, how it was really dark on one side and bright orange on the other. There's just a lot of variation in color of that wood. And then it's on to carving the neck. I'm just going to do this by hand with a saw rasp. Now when I'm carving a neck like this, I don't have a specific neck profile that I'm specifically trying to achieve. Like I don't have a template or a specific shape that I'm aiming for. I'm mostly just carving until the neck feels comfortable. And of course I had some social media stuff splashed on the screen there because this video was originally meant to be broken up into multiple parts, but I ended up deciding not to do that. Of course, that's kind of baked into the video file at this point. Anyway, moving on to carving the volute. And once the shape is mostly done, I'm going to move over to a small orbital sander. Start with some 80 grit paper on it, just to shape the neck a little bit further. And I left that in there too, didn't I? Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing. The video's not over yet. Probably should have taken that out. Anyway. Moving on, this is a very large piece of curly redwood. For people who have watched my channel before, you may recognize this redwood. It was the top for a Telecaster type guitar that I made a couple of years ago as well. This is what happened to the rest of it. Yeah, that redwood is going to be most of the body of this guitar, and the Spalted Maple is going to be the top. So essentially, we have traveled back in time in this video, and now you're seeing me make the top for the body out of this Spalted Maple before I made the covering for the headstock. I was somewhat nervous about this glue up, just because there's some really soft parts of the Spalted Maple along the outer edges where the clamps are pressing in. So I had some concerns that the clamps were going to dent the wood, or More than that, I was concerned that it was going to essentially just crumble some of that outer spalted maple in a way that was going to ruin the top. And you see the person I bought it from had chalked on just a rough guitar shape. And I had been wanting to work with spalted maple for quite a while, and it was based on a PRS Private Stock guitar I had seen years ago and thought, wow, that's a beautiful guitar, I wish I could afford that. But, you know, it was $10,000 and I didn't have that. But I'd been on the lookout for a piece of spalted maple that could do something similar for quite a while, and I finally came across this piece and decided it was time to do it myself. And here, just cutting out the shape of the body from the Redwood. It's surprising how remarkably soft Redwood is. You'd think for trees that large it would be a harder wood, but it really isn't. It's very soft. And once more with toothpicks as locating pins, and just using a couple of body routing templates as clamping calls so that I don't leave any dents in places that I can't afford for them to be. You can see there was one clamp pressing right onto the Redwood, but that's on a part that's going to get carved away for the neck joint later, so it wasn't actually a problem for that to be there. So now that these are joined, I'm cutting out closer to the final shape. And then I get to go over to the router table with the routing template once again in place and finalize the outer shape. And this is where you can really see the edge grain of that redwood start to shine. And it's nice how you can see that curly figuring even in the edge grain as well. Again, while I was doing this, I had concerns about the spalted maple in that I was somewhat afraid that the router bit was going to tear out chunks of it along the edges because of how soft it was. So now while the top is still flat, I'm going to do a bit of drilling and routing. Particularly at this point, routing for the neck pocket. And of course for the pickups. And of course you probably noticed from the thumbnail, this is a 3 pickup guitar in HSS configuration, humbucker in the bridge, and 2 single coils in the middle and neck position. And there, of course, showing off the neck joint. And it's a good fit. So essentially what it came down to in the design process for this guitar is I was making what I thought would be my ideal guitar. And that I wanted a humbucker in the bridge, but I find that I also really like how a middle pickup sounds, and I like single coil in the neck. And we'll see later in the video that I also put a piezo bridge in. And that's what this little part is for. So there's a mini toggle that has to go here. Alright, no, this is for the blade switch. Routing in a little low spot for it so I don't have to try and route through a weird angle once it's carved. But that second part, that's for the mini toggle. Ah yes, and here we have jumped backwards in time again, because you'll notice those holes I just drilled are not there anymore. This was me drawing in the rough layout for where the carve was going to be. don't remember this, but apparently I started the carve before I did any of the drilling. And again, very nervous doing this with an angle grinder on such soft wood. It's a recurring theme. The Spalted Maple made me nervous because it could go wrong at any second. And of course, after a little bit of work with the angle grinder, I decided, this wood is so soft that on the one hand it's nerve-wracking to work with because even the tiniest slip with that angle grinder, while it would be bad with most woods, it would be catastrophic with this wood. And so I decided to work with hand tools for the rest of the carve. And here we've gone back to the future, where all of those holes are now drilled again. And like I said, I'm doing the rest of the carve entirely with hand tools. Just for my own peace. Or so I thought. I brought back the angle grinder for this area because that is that's the part of the spalted maple that's actually still good solid maple. The paler bits are the parts that are really soft. The darker area that actually still looks like maple is still solid maple. I was having enough of a hard time carving through that by hand that I went back to the angle grinder to do the bulk of to remove the bulk of the material. So at this point, most of what's left is going to be sanding, and that can be an issue with spalted maple. Again, the running theme of it's really soft and annoying to work with. Just putting a flat, like the flat face of an orbital sander on there to do a lot of the sanding, you can still end up with low spots because of how inconsistent the hardness of the wood is. So what I'm doing here is just putting wood hardener all over essentially the entire body. And it may look like I'm being really sparing with the wood hardener as I'm applying it, but I'm actually putting it on quite heavily. This wood is just soaking it up so quickly that it's all gone from the brush almost as soon as it's on there. And now I can sand it without too much concern about the softer bits breaking away or crumbling because it's been largely stabilized. That wood hardener is essentially just a very, very thin super glue that soaks into the wood. The downside of that is that after that, working with the wood can gum up sandpaper and other tools because it's full of super glue. So here, moving on to drilling and routing for the control cavity. And of course, carving the comfort carve on the back. Much less nerve-wracking to use an angle grinder on the redwood. Even in spite of how soft it is, it's much more reliable in its consistency than the spalted maple. Actually, the biggest downside and issue I've had working with redwood is that it likes to crack and split quite a bit. Even after it's dry. But the climate I work in here doesn't help that much at all. Where I live, there are huge swings in humidity from season to season. Like at the time of recording, it's summer and humidity is anywhere from 60 to 80%. But over the winter, it can get as low as 10%. If you've ever received a guitar from me and noticed some fret sprout happening, that's probably because I didn't have that guitar over a full winter after I finished building it. It's very common for the guitars that I make that, I make it in the summer when the air is very humid and the wood takes on some of that moisture and expands. And then winter hits and the wood shrinks. And of course, if I've had the guitar for more than 6 months after finishing it, I will have touched up the fret ends over the winter once they start becoming noticeable. And once again, throwing that social media up on the screen because, like I mentioned earlier, this video was originally going to be split up into multiple parts, but I changed my mind. Here, just drilling for the... right here would be the tailpiece. And of course for the bridge. If it isn't obvious, I'm recording this voiceover just watching back the video that I've already edited, doing the commentary in real time as I'm watching. I didn't write down any notes or prepare anything that I wanted to say during the video. I'm pretty much just winging it. As here I'm drilling for... I'm drilling a route for the wires from the pickups. So the first hole was getting the wires from pickup pocket to pickup pocket, and this one is getting from the bridge pickup into the control cavity. Thank you for watching. The video's not done yet. And we're back to the headstock. You can see that headstock facing I put on is quite a bit thinner now because I sanded it down mostly off camera. And here we're getting to actually another somewhat nerve-wracking part. I'm putting on stain. Now this was also the case with the PRS Private Stock that this design was inspired by. The Spalted Maple had stain on it, but only on the parts of it that were still good solid maple. And you might be wondering, justifiably, how exactly do you do that without the stain leaching outward into the other parts of the wood? And I found that once you put the wood hardener on, that fills up the grain to a pretty large extent, enough that it doesn't really spread very far as you're applying it, so that actually made this quite a bit easier than I thought it was going to be. Which is nice, particularly for the really narrow bits that I'm going to have to get the stain into. If I had to guess how PRS does it, I don't know if they put wood hardener on Spalted Maple, particularly not in the same way that I did. They might use, what is it, cactus juice and a vacuum chamber to really get that wood stabilized. Though if I had to guess, I would assume what they do is they put on an initial clear coat over the Spalted Maple as is, and then they do a staining process very similar to what I'm doing, and then put another clear coat over the top of that. But that's just me trying to reverse engineer from a guitar that I haven't actually seen in person. But this is how I ended up doing it. I put on the wood hardener, and I'm also using a stain that has alcohol as a solvent, so it dries very quickly. And then I'm just carefully painting it in with a very small brush. Starting by going along the outside edges, and then I'll use a larger brush to fill in the spaces in between. And as you might imagine, this was a very time-consuming process. I want to say it took maybe 5 hours or so. Yeah, maybe about 5 hours to put in all of the stain. I've actually left quite a bit of this in the video just because personally I find it somewhat satisfying to watch. So I'll shut up for a little bit and let you enjoy it as well. And there it is. Now for anyone that might be asking, why did you choose red for this? Personally, I just think it's the color that looks the best when you're doing something like this. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I've never been all that crazy about blues or greens or purples. I tend to lean towards reds, yellows, just natural wood most of the time. And there's something about the blues, greens, and purples just looks a little too unnatural to me. Like I mentioned earlier, that one clamp had been pressed down on the redwood in this area because it didn't matter since I was going to be carving it away for this neck joint anyway. Good job, camera. Maybe out of focus again. There it goes. Once again, using the angle grinder to do most of the material removal, and then I'm going to use a smaller, much gentler rasp for most of the rest of the carving, just to get the shape nice and comfortable. And then of course sanding it nice and smooth. Here I made one slight mistake. I forgot to drill for the side dots before I glued in the neck. Not a huge deal, but this is a lot more difficult to do once the neck is glued to the body. Mostly because for the ones closer to the body is in the way. Now, keeping with the theme of red, I put in some little copper-colored metallic flakes, and then some red opal for the side dots. Don't honestly remember what happened to my thumb back there, but honestly, you haven't truly built a guitar until you've shed blood on it at some point. So you're just very carefully cutting away some of the headstock facings so that I have a slot to put in the nut. I'm just roughly shaping that on the spindle sander. Makes very quick work of it. Cleaning it up a little bit using a leveling beam which has some sandpaper on it that's, I forget the name of it, but it's got adhesive on the back of it. Pressure sensitive adhesive, that's what it is. And using half of a pencil, I'm going to mark out a line on the inside edge of the nut. That line tells me the deepest point that the string slots in the nut can be. And just putting a few small drops of super glue on the end of the fretboard to attach the nut. As I understand it from people who do repairs, it's better to put the super glue on the end of the fretboard than it is to put it in the bottom of the nut slot. That way, if anyone has to remove the nut in the future, it doesn't end up tearing away wood from the bottom of that slot. And the thing about the super glue is it's not meant to, permanently attach the nut in place. It's just to keep it there so that it doesn't move. Yeah, if you've ever had a guitar where the nut came off, they're not supposed to be hard to remove. They're just supposed to stay in place under most normal conditions. So here I was applying the finish. It's just a spray-on gloss lacquer. And looks like I forgot to set the focus on the camera once again. But now I'm just putting in some shielding paint inside the control cavity and on the inside of the backplate. I did have just enough redwood left over to make the backplate. Unfortunately, not in the right orientation to have the grain perfectly match. As much as I would have liked to have the grain direction match on the back plate as well as on the back. It just wasn't possible. There wasn't enough of it to go around. And now here is where this build started to go sideways, and the reason it took so long to get done. This finish did not turn out well. Now so far, from this angle, it looks okay. But I remember how it ended up looking sometime later, and you'll see more about that in a little bit. So here, my plan was to use an oil finish on the neck rather than having lacquer finish on the neck. And because I had taped off the neck just in a straight line here, I'm now going in with some, I believe this was just 320 grit sandpaper, and sanding away some of that lacquer to make a smoother transition from the hard finish to the oil finish. And I was using this reamer to get the size of the holes for the tuners just right so that they'll fit nicely. And then applying the oil finish to the neck. This is one of the things I really like about Rosewood necks, is that you can use an oil finish on them and still feel the wood while you're playing. I just think that feels so much better than a lacquer finish on the neck. You're just wiping away some of the excess, and then assembling. So you can see the finish on the headstock here. It doesn't look terrible, but it doesn't look that good either. And just installing the anchor points for the tailpiece. I was using a little bit of MDF as something that should be softer even than the Spalted Maple to hopefully not leave any marks, which it didn't. And installing the bridge. I have a history on the channel of people getting very upset at me because for some reason they think I don't install ground wires to the bridge. And of course you saw me putting in those bridge pins without a wire under them. So the way this had worked out is that one of the anchors for the tailpiece is actually slightly poking through inside the control cavity. So my plan for this was originally just to solder that ground wire from the bridge just directly onto that little exposed bit of the anchor from the tailpiece, rather than to have a wire coming through from where the bridge was anchored. You're just rounding over the corners of the nut so that it's not painful if you accidentally bump your hand into it. I'm using some Scotch-Brite pads to just polish that up nice and shiny. And of course, oiling the fretboard. Again, that really is just a beautiful piece of wood I got for this fretboard. Yeah, I'm stringing it up. The pickups I put in it were Fishman, single coils. So the configuration for when you're doing this, it's a SSA and SSP. One of them is single coil active, the others they call single coil passive. I forget which one is the neck and which one is the middle, but you know, their own instructions say that's the way you have to do it if you want this pickup configuration. You know, they're the ones that made the pickups, so I just go along with what they said, because they know it better than I do. Of course, once the strings are on, I can see exactly how much deeper these nut slots need to be in order for the string action to be playable. So there's a little bit more work yet to do on the nut, just to get those strings where I want them to be. And you see the way I'm checking there, I'm pressing down on the string directly over the first fret to see how much movement it has, and then I'm pressing down on in between the second and third frets, and then pressing down on the string above the first fret. There should be a tiny bit of movement before the string touches, but not a lot. And here in this close-up shot you can see how even at this point the finish was starting to not look so good on the top there. It looks weirdly sunken in some places and scratchy, and right there it just looks awful. I want to say I don't know what I was thinking, just going ahead with finishing it at this point, but, you know. Part of it was, I thought, you know, there wasn't any realistic way to fix this because it was just a problem with the wood itself being so uneven, but anyway, past me is about to start talking. Alright, so it's been about 2 years since I originally thought I had finished this build. It had some problems though. The big one, that the electronics just didn't work, and I'm still working on doing something about that. But over time, more problems have shown up, particularly with the finish. It's sinking into the wood, and you can tell some spots are nice and bright and shiny, and other spots are really dull. And some of this has to do with the fact that, well, they were blaming COVID at the time, but there was a shortage of the good quality lacquer that I like to use, and all I could get was some cheap stuff. And that cheap stuff was just not good at all. Luckily now I've got some of the good stuff again, so what I want to do is go in and try to fill in some of these dips and voids so I can actually get a nice smooth surface, and then sand it down a bit, hopefully not enough that I have to redo the stain, and then recoat it with the good lacquer. And then I can get the electronics working, and hopefully this will be a good guitar by then. So there it was. This finish really came out awful. And at a certain point, I just couldn't stand it anymore. This guitar was just sitting in a corner, not being played, not having anything done with it. Couldn't really stand looking at it. It was just terrible. And yeah, I reached a point where I couldn't stand it anymore and decided it was time to at least try to do something about it. So like I had mentioned just a few minutes ago in my commentary, I thought that this issue with the wood having these dips in it and low spots all over the place was something that the only way I could have fixed it was to just sand down everything even farther, carve everything even deeper to try and get past those low spots. But what I ended up doing, like you just saw, was taking some medium thick super glue and just trying to fill in those spots. Because that super glue is going to dry totally clear. And the spots, once they've got finish in them and the light reflects off them in just that way, they look a lot deeper than they actually are. So ultimately this is only putting a very small amount of super glue in there to fill those up. And once the final finish is on, it's just not going to be visible at all. And of course my thought that, maybe if I do this carefully enough, I won't have to redo all of the stain. Yeah, I was completely wrong on that. I ended up having to redo the stain multiple times before this was all done. Alright, so you've seen my story about the original lacquer finish that didn't work. Now you get the story about how the second lacquer finish didn't work either. Got some kind of crazy finish checking all over it just immediately. Don't know why, but ended up deciding it wasn't the right choice, so I've stripped it all completely off. We're back to bare wood, and I've re-stained all of the parts of the wood that got stained. It was a very long process, but now I'm going to try something different with the finish. I'm going to start by attempting a base coat of Crimson Guitar's penetrating oil finish. It's a little bit nerve-wracking. The reason I originally did a spray lacquer was because I thought that had the best chance of not smearing the stain around any place that I didn't want it to be. But now that I'm going to a wipe-on finish, that's a possibility again. So I've left this for several hours for the stain to dry. Hopefully that's long enough. But if not, then the camera gets to witness disaster. So yes, the first refinish did not work. So, like I mentioned, had to strip it all back off again, restain the whole guitar again, and try all over from the beginning with a different type of finish. So, although I was worried about the oil lifting the stain, and you can kind of see on the cloth that I'm using there, a little bit of stain came up. It didn't smear all over, so this really did work out quite nicely. And the nice thing about this penetrating oil is that it is actually, penetrating into the wood and stabilizing it even further, in addition to what the wood hardener was already doing. So here it's a little hard to see, particularly from this camera angle, but at this point I'm applying the wipe-on polyurethane. And the thought was that doing this with the wipe-on was going to work out better because, you can apply extremely, extremely thin coats and have really good control over, how smooth the finish is as it goes on. And you can see this is just after wiping on the finish. I haven't sanded or polished at all, and it looks pretty good. Obviously needs more work, but pretty good. Alright, here I am. It is now summer of 2025. This guitar has been in the works for 3 years. I started redoing its finish in 2024. There's a whole lot of refinishing that I did not bother to film because honestly, how many times can you film sanding back and refinishing and sanding back and refinishing and sanding and polishing and realizing it's not right and sanding it back and refinishing and all of that. I've finally gotten it to about the point where I'm ready to be done with it, or at least ready to call it done. I think for the most part the finish looks really good. It's not perfect, but nothing ever is. Now there's these odd little bits of cleanup I have to do in order to get the guitar put back together. So right now I have to widen out this slot because the blade switch doesn't fit in it anymore after all the new coats of finish. Luckily this little file is exactly the same size as the blade on the switch. Once I get it all the way through here, hopefully I can finish putting this back together. Okay, so this part makes me a little nervous because this bridge pin has to go back in here. And of course, this filled up with some finish in the refinishing, and it no longer fits. Which means I need to drill it out again. Unfortunately, that means there's a big risk of chipping the finish around here. That's better. It did start to chip. I'm gonna get some super glue under that and fix it. Alright, so here I'm just testing the electronics. First up, the Piezo bridge. In that middle position we have both the Piezo and the magnetic pickups. And one last thing. The push-pull in the tone knob single coils the bridge pickup. And of course the wonderful rat's nest of wiring. Like I mentioned before, I couldn't get the grain to line up with both the back plate and the back of the body because there simply wasn't a large enough piece of wood left for that to be possible. Yeah, that is this guitar, finally done after only 3 years. Safe to say I have learned quite a lot about getting high gloss finishes from this whole process, so guitars in the future should turn out a lot better. Now those of you with keen eyes might notice that these chrome knobs that I'm putting on right here are not the same as what appear in the thumbnail. I ultimately ended up deciding that the chrome was just a little too shiny, a little too bright. It didn't look that good. So I got a different set of knobs. They're essentially the same knobs, they're just black metal instead of chrome, but they still have the abalone tops. Of course I put on the wrong switch tip as well. Here's just a quick check to see how much it weighs with everything back on. And it comes out to 7 pounds, 2 ounces.